how to cooperate with the European Union, and the European Union is our close neighbor. If you have to trade with the United States, with China, it's more complicated. By the way, I'm not sure whether you had the opportunity to watch the video of the lecture that Mario Draghi delivered on Friday. He was given a degree honoris causa. And I suggest you to have a look, because it's about half an hour and I learned a lot. He was able to explain why it's important, it's difficult to trade with the United States, with China, and he was able to explain what is the benefit in very objective terms that a cooperation within the European Union may deliver to European citizens. So it was interesting, I tell you, for sustainability, for understanding some more, very, very clear. And so I think there is the video available, and there is also the written speech. I suggest you to get to have a look. And no matter what is your opinion about European cooperation, Mario Draghi, whatever, I think it is interesting for everybody. Okay, so global forums. The first example that I could find about a global forum on something related to sustainability is the European Water Charter, 1968. So I think it is important for you to notice that in order to identify international regulation about water, or an attempt to provide an international regulation about water, I couldn't go back more than 1968. It means that 1968 is 50 years ago. It means that before than that you can find some national regulation. So we have in Italy still a rule that was issued by the king in 1933 for some issues related to water. But we couldn't find any international regulation before than that. Which means that water resources management, water, was not a concern before than 50 years ago. And I tell you, this is indeed true. It was not a concern. Water was intended to be an infinite good, indefinitely available. Before than that, it was only around the mid of the previous century, so about 50 years ago, that we realized that water is not infinite. It's not indefinitely available. In the past, it was not a problem because rivers were not polluted. Think about the Po River. If the water of the Po River was drinkable, you understand that people didn't have any problem to find water. And also keep in mind that up to the Second World War, it was not considered a necessity to have water inside the house. People were used to have a fountain in the garden or to take water from the river by maybe walking 1 hour. And again, water inside the houses was not a need. So you can understand that the consumption of water and the need for water was much lower than today. Today, if I asked you, I would like to ask you, do you have an idea of how many liters of water you use in a day? I'm sure that you are underestimating it. And for instance, when you flush the toilet, is at least 5 liters. So at the end of the story, you easily use 100 liters of water per day, and you drink maybe a couple of liters. But if you take a shower, it's about 20-25 liters. And then you flush the toilet, it's 5 liters each time, and etc. Usually in engineering design, what we say is that for an individual house, we need to be safe 150 liters per person per day. And this is it's a design that takes into account only the individual needs. If you have to design a water supply system for a city, you may know that they are designed for 400 liters of water per person per day. And the reason is that you have also to provide water for cleaning the streets, etc. But just for an house, I tell you, the design is 150. And if you try to minimize, really minimize your water needs, it's very hard to go below 20 liters per day per person, very hard. And you have to really minimize it in a very strict way. So, again, this reasoning highlights that today we have water needs that are much higher than in the past. And this is why, this is another component of the concern, emerging concern for water resources management. Again, this is positive because it means that our lifestyle is increased, our level of well-being is increased, but on the other hand, we have to look forward. So, the European Water Charter, let me just show you. I go back to my web page because I think it is interesting to look at what they say. One second, here it is. Okay, let me try to. So these are the articles of the European Water Charter of 1968. And there are some of them that are really interesting. First of all, you see the first one, there is no life without water. So this is our starting point. And of course it's obvious, but at that time, if it was used as a first article, it means that it was not so obvious. And then there are some articles that are interesting. The second one is freshwater resources are not inexhaustible. We just talked about it. The third one is to pollute water is to harm man and other living creators, which again is obvious today. It was not at that time. And let me focus on this one, the maintenance of an adequate vegetation cover, preferably forest land, is imperative for the conservation of water resources. And again, this was something that was realized at that time, that the environment was to be considered as a unique system. Okay, and this is extremely interesting. Water resources must be assessed. This is really forward-looking and explains why, as a part of this subject, we will focus on water resources assessment. Because in order to use something wisely, you have to know availability of what you are planning to use. And water resources availability is still a big problem because it's not easy to measure how much water is available. And link between water conservation and scientific research, and that's it. Now, let me focus on the other forums. In 1972, a conference was convened in Stockholm. It was the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. And for the first time, it emerged that first of all, this was the first global forum on sustainability and the environment. And for the first time, it emerged that environment and sustainability have political implications, which is, of course, today widely accepted. If you want, as I said, to set up a good environmental policy, you have to seek a connection with politics. And this conference triggered several initiatives at the global level to discuss what are the pillars for environmental protection and then later sustainable development. There was another very significant conference in 1992. It was the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. also called the Rio Summit, the Rio Conference. It was attended by more than 100 head of states. It was a significant step forward, but it was 26 years ago. So you see that this is a discipline, sustainability, sustainable development, that is still in its infancy. It's a very young discipline. There were other summits that are listed here, and in 2012, the Rio Plus 20 conference was convened, and which was an attempt to recap after 20 years on the objectives and the achievements after the Rio conference. And these conferences are basically focusing on the politics, on environmental protection and sustainability. Politics means international agreements. I said that there were other important conferences that were triggered by these ones, like the Kyoto Conference that proposed the Kyoto Protocol on climate change. And also there are the conferences on climate, the COP conferences, COP, and they are held periodically in order to try to establish a political agreement on mitigation of climate change, a reduction of CO2 emissions. You have a complete list on my webpage. You don't need to learn by memory everything. The message here is that this is a topic that is still under discussion, a topic that is relatively young. And now we have to move to the technical part. We have to try to focus on what was agreed there that is relevant to engineers. And basically, what was the outcome of these conferences? It was agreed that we need to make a systematic scrutiny of patterns of production, particularly the production of toxic components, production of CO2 emissions. We need to make an inventory of what are the processes and what is their influence. In the same way as we need an inventory of water resources, we need an inventory of CO2 emissions per country and for each production chain. It was agreed that we need alternative sources of energy to replace the use of fossil fuels, and you know that there is an increasing interest in renewables, and we will see what is some important considerations about that. There was an agreement on the need for innovative system for public transportation, and also there was an agreement on the critical issue of water resources management. So you can find several deliberations and several recommendations to countries that came out of these conferences, and you have a more extended treatment in the web pages, which are related to these topical issues that were identified. And for instance, you may know the Agenda 21 that came out from the Rio Summit, which is a non-binding action plan of the United Nations to ensure sustainability. It's an action agenda, and which contains recommendations for water resources management as well. And the 21 refers to the 21st century. Now, sustainability became, as I said, a political issue. And if you want to find one of the first examples, in 2000, the presidential electoral campaign in the United States by Al Gore, who didn't win, was almost completely based on mitigation of climate change, and he was later awarded the Nobel Prize for his efforts in favor of mitigation of climate change. So sustainability and climate change became politically very important. If you think about the presidential campaign for the United States, you understand, which is fully, almost, or let's say mainly concentrated on sustainability and environmental protection, you can easily understand that this is becoming an extremely important issue. And also, if you follow today the discussion on actions by the current President Trump of the United States, you see that his position about environmental protection, climate change is very clear. And it's one of the main themes of international politics, which means that the problem is relevant, but also solutions are complicated to identify for obvious reasons. And here there is a key feature. When we talk about sustainability, basically people imply mainly climate change. When we talk about environmental protection, sustainability, water, there has been a progressive shift towards climate change, which became, in the past 20 years, one of the most relevant global concerns. And what is the reason why climate change is perceived as a dominant concern rather than water pollution, rather than water scarcity? This is the result, on the one hand, of a political will, because climate change affects the whole humanity. Also water scarcity, but water is still experienced as a local problem because water cannot be transferred, and therefore you understand that if you live in Sweden, for instance, in a water-rich country, you don't really feel that water is a problem, while you feel that climate change is a problem, because climate change doesn't have any boundary. Water has boundaries. The boundary of water resources is the river basin, the catchment. The catchment is the rain collector, and therefore this is the boundary of water resources management. And water, it's hard to transfer. It's not like gas that can be easily transferred. Water is difficult to transfer. And the reason is that water is heavy and it's needed in very relevant volume. These are specificities of water. Water is heavy, it weighs a lot, and when we talk about water use, the volume of involved water is extremely high. This is the reason why only in very critical situations you ensure water supply by water transfer. Like you use trucks to bring water to cities who experience a water scarcity or a drought. But this is a very last solution because you can't deliver much water. If you think about your personal use of water, I said 150, or let's say 100 liters per day, it means 100 kilograms per day, it means 1/10 of cubic meter per day, which means that if you are a family of 5 people, you need half cubic meter per day, 500 kilograms. You understand that it's very difficult to transfer. If you think about the need of a family for gas, this is much easier to transfer. Much easier, definitely. And this is why we buy gas from Russia, but we don't buy water from Sweden, because it's hard to transfer. We cannot build a huge pipe. When we talk about a water pipe, it's about 1 meter 1.5 meter of diameter. You cannot build a pipe of 1.5 meter of diameter traveling from Sweden to south of Italy. You can build a pipe bringing gas because it's a very small pipe. You cannot transfer water in this way. So again, water, it's not really perceived as a global concern. We know that there are countries experiencing water scarcity. We know that one of the main reasons why Africa is suffering, one of the main reasons of migration is water scarcity in Africa. But we don't really perceive water scarcity as a big challenge. And if you also think about Italy, okay, we know that there are some months where we have to be careful about water use, but we don't really perceive water scarcity as a major threat. Instead, when there are floods, and the number of floods is increasing, or let's say at least the number of flood reports is increasing, everybody calls into play climate change, and therefore climate change is perceived as a global problem. But probably we are a bit misled in these perceptions, because it isn't wise to give to water scarcity lower priority with respect to climate change. First, because the very first reason is that water scarcity and climate change are strictly related. A second good reason is that the climate system includes the water cycle, and water plays a relevant role in the climate system. And therefore, even from a scientific point of view, it's not wise to give different priority to these two systems, the water system and the climate system. Third, even from a societal point of view, if you look at the problems caused at the global level by water scarcity, the number of deaths, whatever indicator you decide to choose, and you look at the indicators of climate change, you clearly perceive that we shouldn't give lower priority to other problems related to water with respect to climate change. So, as I said, we are a bit misled in this. But it's indeed true that there is a shift toward climate change, and if you look at the attention of politicians, or if you look at funding by governments and by funding institutions, funding for whatever, research activity or for solutions to problems, you see that there is a dominance of funding for mitigating climate change with respect to funding for mitigating the water problem. So it's extremely important that we try as technicians to give the correct priority to the problems that we have to solve, because priorities means allocation of funds, allocation of resources in general, allocation of attention, and identifying the correct priorities is an essential requirement for an engineer. And let me say also that, there is also another problem, that climate change, like any scientific activity, climate research, like any scientific activity dealing with the environment, deals with uncertainty. Like water resources management deals with uncertainty. There is a lot of uncertainty in our capability to understand and predict the water cycle and the climate system. And therefore, when you convey, you communicate about a problem and possible solution, and there is uncertainty in our capability to deal with the problem, it becomes extremely important to be very objective, to be very transparent. And this increased the political attention to climate change and the increased attention by the media, by society, transparency and hard goal to achieve. And this also originates a bit of distrust in scientific research, because people, if you don't communicate uncertainty in a clear way, people realize that sometimes predictions by scientists are wrong, and therefore, you know, a bit of distrust may emerge, which is absolutely concerning, absolutely to avoid, because, you know, if you want to reach a public consensus, if you want to catalyze the attention of people, you need transparency, and you need to make people trust in you. And if you are not very transparent, if you don't show uncertainty in a transparent way, then a bit of distrust may originate, and this is not good, because you know, the distrust of people in politics, in science, in institutions is detrimental for reaching an effective solution. And also there is a distrust of engineering. If you look at recent developments, there is you know, some people are not really confident that engineers can propose reliable solutions. And also there is the false impression that infrastructures are to be avoided. Like today, it's extremely difficult to reach the consensus for building new dams, for instance. But dams are extremely important for societal development and for water resources management. But it's you know, the advent also of the green politics, which is very positive on the one hand. On the other hand, it tends to originate distrust in the value of infrastructures. Like you see also the discussions on the TAV line from Turin to Lyon. And you know, there is an increasing concern about the usefulness of infrastructures, which, you know, of course we don't have to exaggerate, we don't have to build more dams than what is necessary, but on the other hand, the reaction shouldn't be we don't build any more dam, because otherwise it's really a problem. Of course, there is, on the one hand, we need to be very careful about the environment, there is no question about that. On the other hand, you know, if you want to live in the environment, if humans want to live in the environment is not done for humans. We need to build houses, we need to build infrastructures, we need to have an impact. Otherwise, the environment is very hostile in its natural configuration. And so it's an essential requirement, the fact that humans need to transform the environment to make it livable. And if we don't accept this concept, it's a bit of a problem. Now let's focus on sustainability. What is sustainability? So it was first defined in ecology. In ecology, it was defined as the property of biological systems to remain diverse and productive. This is not a definition that we can use in this form. And, but we can extend the concept of sustainability to any environmental, political, and economical system. And the idea to extend the concept of sustainability to societal development dates back to 1980, more or less. And at that time, it was a common belief, and this is an essential premise that you have to fix in your mind. It was a common belief that societal development and sustainability were antithetic. So what was the idea? To create a term, sustainable development, to prove that they are and they shouldn't be antithetic. So this is the idea at the basis of sustainable development. Therefore, engineering, global economy, were identified at that time as the enemies of environmental protection and restoration. I just talked about it. Engineering as an enemy of the environment. And therefore the idea was to introduce a concept to show that they are not antithetic. So, who had this idea? And this idea, as I said, dates back to 1980. And the World Conservation Strategy of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which was an international institution, dedicated for the first time a brief chapter of its conservation strategy on a concept called sustainable development, which was not really defined at that time. Later on, in 1983, the Secretary Pérez de Cuéllar of the United Nations decided to form a commission that was in charge to focus on environmental and developmental problems and solutions, and asking the Prime Minister of Norway, family name Brundtland, to chair it. And therefore this was called the Brundtland Commission. Again, it was a commission of the United Nations, but Pérez de Cuéllar wanted it to be independent, that was in charge of focusing on environmental protection and developmental problems. In 1987, the Commission published the first volume called Our Common Future, where they proposed a definition for sustainable development, which is now today commonly accepted. Here you can see the definition, which is something that we heard already about. Sustainable development is development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Look at the focus on future generations. So we have two concepts in this definition. The concept of needs, and there was a focus on the needs of the poor countries, and the idea of future needs, future generations, which is something that, you know, usually people don't have a long perspective. If you talk about needs of future generation for the next 50 years, people are sensitive because they think to their own children and grandchildren. If you talk about the needs of future generation in 2300, in 300 years from now, people are not very sensitive. And this is why some scientists focusing on climate change talk about horizon of their prediction 2100, 8 years from now. Didn't you ever wonder why they say 2100? If they said 2500, people wouldn't care. If you say 2100, people say, okay, 8 years from now, my children are still there, and therefore people are a bit concerned. And this is the reason why the same researchers or politicians, they talk about rapid climate change. They talk about actions to be taken very quickly. The reason is that our horizon for the future is very limited. The horizon of humanity, it's difficult for humanity to think 1,000 years ahead. It's something that doesn't give any concern. Why? You know, of course, we know that the life on Earth is going to finish, and we know that we can't make a strategy that is going to last for 1,000 years. But still, 1,000 years is a reasonable horizon, and we should, in a way, keep in mind. We should, in a way, try to predict that, you know, Earth resources, what kind of Earth resources people will have in the far future. because as I said, life is not going to last forever. We know that, but still it may last like a couple of million of years, maybe. Why not? And therefore we shouldn't, we should try to look forward. Okay, this is our definition. Definition doesn't give anything from a technical point of view. Keep in mind, for now I'm just talking. I'm just saying things that at the exam I will not ask you. I will not ask you what was the name of the commission who proposed the idea of sustainable development. At the exam I will ask you what are the technical requirements for water resources management. This is not a question, because technical requirement is too generic, but I may ask you how do you assess surface water availability, for instance. So again, now we are just talking about premises. Now let's going into more details. Later on, the United Nations identified the pillars of sustainability. And I anticipate proposed the Sustainable Development Goals. We are moving slowly to the technical part of it. Now, pillars of sustainability: economy, society, environment. And here we are starting getting some information. So we have to consider, when we talk about water resources management, about environment, society, economy, and their intersection. They are extremely important. So what does it mean that I meet environmental needs and economic needs? What does it mean if I meet environmental needs with societal needs? Their intersection identifies our possible actions, and in particular, here you have a sketch of these intersections with an interpretation of what their intersection means. So, if you think to an action that meets environmental needs and economic needs, it's a viable action. If you think to an action